The afternoon light, pale and fractured, came through the stained glass of St. Aldate's like an apology. It caught the dust in thin ribbons, turned the pews into dark ribs of wood, and left me wondering why truth so often hides in the quietest corners. Lewis waited by the font, shuffling his feet with the reverence of a man afraid to disturb the dead. He had that look again, the one that meant someone, somewhere, had died in a manner untidy enough to summon me from an unfinished crossword. I remember thinking of the clue I'd left unsolved on my kitchen table. Confession, before an ending 7, I'd written admittal, crossed it out, then left the page open, as if the word might change itself while I was gone. Perhaps that was why I followed Lewis out into the rain without protest. Guilt, I've learned, is the best spur to curiosity. The death had occurred inside the church itself. A young curate, scarcely 30, found slumped beneath the lectern after evensong. The coroner would later call it an accident of the heart. I have never trusted accidents of the heart. They tend to conceal deliberate failings of the soul. We walked the nave together, the sound of our steps softened by centuries of devotion. Lewis told me what little there was to tell a few parishioners lingering after the service, a vicar who claimed the boy had seemed distracted, a chalice misplaced, and, most curiously, the church door left unlatched. That last detail clung to me like the smell of candle wax. In Oxford, nothing sacred is ever left unlatched. I studied the lectern, its brass eagle dulled by the touch of too many hands. The body had fallen forward, Lewis said, as if in prayer. But the pattern of bruising on the forehead he showed me in the photograph later spoke of something less devout. There was a mark in the shape of the eagle's wing, only slightly misaligned. A small thing, easily dismissed, but small things, I've learned, are what the dead leave behind when words fail them. Outside, the rain had turned mean. The windows of the nearby college were beginning to glow, and the bells from Christ Church drifted through the damp like a warning. I asked Lewis for the curate's name. He hesitated before telling me. That hesitation mattered more than the name itself. In my line of work, truth rarely presents itself in complete sentences. It comes as a hesitation, a misplaced glass, the nervous twitch of a man who knows too much about mercy. Lewis said the curate had been researching the church's restoration accounts. Nothing criminal in that, surely, but I've seen enough parish ledgers to know that holiness and honesty make uneasy companions. We spoke to the vicar in the vestry, where the air smelt of starch and mould. He was a courteous man, pale and tremulous, the sort who apologizes even when blessed. He insisted the curate was troubled by doubts about faith, about vocation. He spoke the word vocation as if it were a fragile relic that might splinter in his mouth. I asked if there had been arguments. Only the usual kind, he said, which is to say, the kind no one forgets. As he spoke, my eyes caught a reflection in the leaded window behind him, light breaking across the glass, bending into colours that no painter could name. For a moment it seemed the face of the dead man hovered there, indistinct, watching. But memory is a treacherous painter too. What I really saw, perhaps, was my own reflection, blurred, uncertain, caught between colours. Later that night, back in my flat, I poured a measure of whiskey and reopened the crossword. Confession. Before an ending. 7. The word came to me, suddenly, that admittal had been close but not enough. The answer was revealed. I wrote it down and stared at it until the letters lost meaning. Somewhere, beneath the rain and the lit windows of Oxford, someone else was writing their own confession in a more permanent ink. It was then, I think, that I began to suspect the curate's death was not a solitary act of faith or despair, but the shadow of a truth too bright to bear. Light through lead, fractured, still reaching, that was how I saw him. And that was how I knew the case had only just begun. The morning began with the kind of silence that does not belong to Oxford, the silence of something freshly absent. I drove to St. Aldwyn's under a low ceiling of cloud, the kind that flattens the light and turns the world to watercolour. Lewis had already cordoned off the small courtyard behind the vestry, though the gesture felt absurdly formal for a death so intimate. The curate, now cold and still beneath the tarpaulin, had once given sermons about forgiveness. That morning he required none. I have never liked the smell of wet stones. It seems to retain every sorrow it has ever absorbed. The rain had brought the scent up from the ground, mixing with the sweetness of crushed yew leaves. A constable nodded as I passed. I caught the faint glimmer of pity in his eyes, as if murder were a contagion and I, its unwilling host. Lewis said the doctor confirmed it was heart failure, most likely. I told him I had never believed in failure that tidy. The vicar was inside, sitting beside the open piano in the church hall. His hands folded as though prayer could retroactively alter anatomy. He spoke softly of the curate's devotion, his humility, his sleepless nights. Yet there was a hesitation when I asked about friendship. I've learned that hesitation has a frequency of its own, like the moment before thunder. I noticed a small mark on the vicar's thumb, a thin crescent of green. Organ polish, perhaps. Or perhaps from turning the church ledger, whose cover was the same shade of worn malachite. I asked if the curate had been working on those accounts again the previous evening. The vicar's eyes flickered toward the locked cabinet behind him. An involuntary glance, but telling enough. I made a note of it, though not in any notebook. Outside, the bells began to chime the quarter hour, indifferent to chronology or grief. Lewis rejoined me with a report a parishioner had seen the curate enter the church long after Vespers, carrying something wrapped in brown paper. No one had seen him leave. The package was not among his effects. Missing things, I've always thought, tell their own kind of truth, quieter, but more reliable than words. We walked through the nave again, the lectern, the choir stalls, the half-melted candles, everything unchanged, as if frozen in the last breath before discovery. I found myself looking up at the clerestory windows where the leaded glass, centuries old, filtered the grey daylight into faint pools of colour. I remembered the phrase from the coroner's preliminary note, cause of death, sudden collapse, natural causes not excluded. A perfect sentence for burying guilt beneath grammar. A draught crept through the north door. I followed it out of habit, though Lewis muttered something about my intuition being more superstition than sense. The lock was scratched, shallow, but recent. Someone had fumbled there, either entering or leaving in haste. I crouched, tracing the marks with a fingertip. The rain had darkened them unevenly. If they were older, they'd have vanished by now. That was when I saw the faint glimmer of wax near the hinges of candle wax, clear, as if someone had carried a lit taper into the rain. It made no sense to Lewis, it never does at first, but to me it whispered of secrecy, of a meeting unfit for daylight. I imagined the curate, nervous, stepping out into the cold with that brown paper parcel, the candle trembling, the door closing behind him with an echo that no one heard. By noon the body was gone, the church restored to its patient quiet. I lingered a little longer. There are places where silence insists upon being understood, and St. Aldwyn's was one. On the altar lay an open Bible. I glanced at the page before leaving. Rejoice not when the enemy falleth. The verse number 20-17 struck me like a clue in a half-finished puzzle, a coordinate waiting to be connected. Numbers, like people, reveal their meanings slowly. Back in the car, I wrote it down on the margin of a newspaper. It seemed trivial then, but later that number would return carved into something far less holy than stone. It was Lewis who first mentioned the committee. He said it as if referring to something bureaucratic and harmless, an inevitable gathering of Oxford minds who met to discuss heating budgets or hymn selections. But the word carried a different gravity when spoken in the damp echo of St. Aldwyn's, the Committee of Restoration, formally. A small circle of parish figures overseeing the church's ongoing repairs, the vicar, 2 donors, and a bursar from the college across the lane. A benign arrangement on paper, as all conspiracies are at first glance. I spent the afternoon tracing their names through records that smelt faintly of mildew and pencil lead. Each signature seemed to tilt differently, as though the ink itself doubted its purpose. The curate had been preparing a report for them, a financial summary of donations and expenses. It was never delivered. I wondered what kind of man dies between the writing of figures and their presentation, one too honest, perhaps, or one too frightened. Lewis fetched coffee from the corner cafe, leaving damp footprints along the library tiles. When he returned, he placed the cups carefully beside the parish ledger I'd requested. It was thick with additions, but something bothered me. The dates in one column, the payments for restoration work, moved backward instead of forward. A simple clerical error, perhaps, but I've never believed in simple errors. Time, in the wrong hands, becomes an accomplice. I asked Lewis who kept the keys to the church vault. Only the vicar and the bursar, he said, though the curate sometimes borrowed them to verify receipts. Verify? An oddly moral word for a man who had spent his final hour kneeling before an altar that no longer answered. I closed the ledger and leaned back, listening to the faint hum of rain against the stained glass panes. Oxford always sounds the same when secrets are about to surface, patient, damp, indifferent. That evening we attended the committee meeting. It was held in the parish hall, a place of unremarkable architecture and faint resentment. The vicar presided at one end of a long table, his voice measured, his eyes too pale for comfort. Beside him sat the bursar, thin-lipped, precise, and already tired of being questioned. The 2 donors were women, one elderly, swathed in perfume that fought the must of hymnals, the other younger, detached, her gaze elsewhere entirely. Grief, guilt, or boredom I couldn't yet decide. The vicar spoke of the tragedy, the bursar spoke of finances. The younger woman said nothing, only tapped her pen against the table in intervals of 3. I noted it without knowing why. Rhythm is its own confession. When my turn came, I asked about the curate's final hours. They exchanged glances, rehearsed in their discomfort. The vicar said the young man had been anxious about inaccuracies in the books. The bursar corrected him merely for administrative delays, nothing untoward. Their disagreement was too polite to be innocent. Afterward, as the committee dispersed into the rain, I lingered near the bulletin board. There was a printed notice about the restoration schedule, Phase 4 roof reinforcement, projected completion, February 24th, the number again. 24:17, it echoed the verse from the altar Bible, the one that had caught my eye the day before. Coincidence, perhaps, but I have always distrusted coincidence in the company of the dead. Lewis caught up with me outside. He muttered something about my tendency to chase phantoms through paperwork. I told him phantoms leave better trails than the living. They have no reason to lie. He laughed, but softly. He never laughs loudly. In the rain. Later, alone in my flat, I poured a whiskey and read through my notes. Committee meetings, ledgers, figures reversed in time. I drew a line through the bursar's name, then through the vicar's, then hesitated. It wasn't the living who interested me most anymore, but the absence of the missing package, the vanished report, the silence in the younger donor's eyes. There was a pattern here, something rhythmic and deliberate, like the tapping of her pen. I stared out at the lamps of Walton Street, their reflections stretching like questions on wet glass. The committee had been formed to save a church, but perhaps unknowingly they had already buried one of their own beneath its stones. It arrived, as these things sometimes do, without a sender and without ceremony. A blue envelope, faintly creased, slid beneath my door one morning while I was still half asleep over a lukewarm cup of coffee. The handwriting was thin and deliberate, each letter the same height as if the writer had learned penmanship from Scripture. I stared at it for a while before opening it, the way one regards a wasp resting on glass. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, no letterhead, no greeting, only a brief message typed in that same monastic precision. There are 2 deaths at St. Aldwyn's, you have only found one. Lewis thought it was a prank. He said Oxford breeds eccentrics faster than logic. I told him logic, like ivy, only survives by attaching itself to madness. He didn't laugh. He rarely did when the air turned like that. We took the envelope to the station anyway. There was no fingerprint, no smudge of skin, no trace of haste in the folds. Whoever sent it had taken care, and care is what guilt often disguises itself as. The paper was of the sort used for college correspondence, faintly textured, expensive, unnecessary. The typewriter ink had bled slightly on the A of Aldwyn's, suggesting an older machine, maybe one of those heavy Remingtons the colleges still keep for ceremonial letters. 2 deaths. I repeated it to myself as we drove past the high walls of Worcester College, the rain streaking the windscreen in slow diagonals. There's something unnerving about arithmetic in a message like that. Numbers promise certainty, yet their meaning depends entirely on what or whom they are counting. At St. Aldwyn's, the vicar greeted us with that pained politeness reserved for the bereaved and the accused alike. He denied knowing anything about the letter, which was expected, but when I mentioned the word 2, a faint tremor crossed his mouth, not quite fear, not quite recognition, something more private. He said there had been another incident years earlier, a suicide long before the curate's arrival. A young restorer working on the stained glass had fallen from the scaffolding during evening rain. A tragedy, he called it. But the way he said evening rain made it sound almost rehearsed. The file still existed, buried in the archives at County. I spent half the afternoon persuading a clerk to find it. Thin as a hymn book, the report contained only what bureaucracy requires: name, age, probable cause. But the photograph inside was arresting a figure on the nave floor, surrounded by fragments of blue glass. The same glass, I realized, formed the north window of the church, the one the curate had loved for its depiction of St. Matthew and the angel. The fatal shard had come from that very panel. Lewis thought it was a coincidence. I thought about repetition, which is subtler. The same window, 2 deaths apart. I asked him to bring me the restoration accounts again, and there it was, an entry, backdated 3 years, for window repair, private donation. The donor's name was missing, a dash, Oxford's neatest way of saying we prefer not to remember. That evening I walked alone through the church, the air colder than it had any right to be. A faint scent of turpentine lingered, as if someone had been cleaning the brass recently. I stood beneath the north window and looked up. The repaired section glowed slightly brighter than the rest, like a conscience stitched into a lie. It was then that I saw the pattern. Each pane bore a small etched numeral, invisible unless caught by the light. I counted them. All consecutive except one missing between 14 and 16. 17, again the number, the Bible verse, the restoration phase, the window, a thread weaving through accidents that no longer seemed accidental. When I told Lewis later, he looked at me as if I'd started believing in ghosts. Perhaps I had, but ghosts are only memories. that refused to die politely. I told him to find out who funded that first restoration. He said he'd try, though his voice had the flatness of a man who knows he will find more than he wants. That night, I placed the blue envelope back on my desk. The light from the window turned it almost grey. I thought of the missing pain, the missing donor, the missing confession. Some absences, I've learned, are more deliberate than any presence. He was called Signor Bellini, though I doubted that was his real name. Oxford has always attracted its share of displaced craftsmen, those who work in the margins of beauty, repairing what others have carelessly damaged. Bellini had come years before, hired to restore the stained glass at St. Aldwyn's after the first accident. The parish had praised his skill, the vicar his humility, the newspapers his artistry. But no one, it seemed, had asked where he had learned to hide his mistakes. Lewis and I found him in a small studio off Cowley Road. The air there was heavy with varnish and rain. Sheets of coloured glass leaned against the walls like exhausted saints. He worked without gloves, his fingers marked by thin cuts that bled in quiet constancy. When I asked about the restoration, he smiled not with pleasure, but with the kind of irony reserved for men who know they have been remembered for the wrong reasons. He said he had replaced only what was broken, that the church had wanted brilliance, not accuracy, that the window had been dull for centuries until he touched it. I asked whether the brilliance came from new glass or from something else. He pretended not to understand. Lewis shifted behind me, uneasy with the way the man's calm resisted interrogation. There was a photograph pinned above the workbench, a younger Bellini standing beside the vicar, the bursar, and a woman I recognized from the committee meeting, the younger donor, the one who tapped her pen. In the photograph, she was looking not at the camera, but at Bellini himself, her expression half-formed, as if affection had been interrupted by guilt. It was a detail that stayed with me longer than it should have. I asked him about her. He said she had been kind, unusually so, that she came often during the restoration to watch the light change through the glass. Her name, he said after a pause, was Lydia, a name that felt rehearsed, as if it had once belonged to someone else. I told him the curate had admired the same window, and that he too had spent evenings there, alone. Bellini's hands still. Then he turned back to his work, arranging fragments of cobalt and amber into a pattern that seemed to contradict geometry. He asked if I believed in accidents. I told him I believed in repetition, which is something different. He smiled again faintly. Then he said the curious thing that the window would always demand payment because it had been built on a promise. I waited for him to continue, but he did not. Some truths, I've learned, prefer to live unfinished. When we left, Lewis remarked that the man was mad. I disagreed. Madness, I told him, rarely preserves order so precisely. Bellini had arranged his tools by size, his pigments by hue, his sins by omission. On the way out, I noticed a ledger on the windowsill, its cover speckled with dust. Inside, among sketches and invoices, was a receipt for a private commission dated 2 months before the curate's death, replication and replacement of the missing section, north window, 2417, the same number again, binding the church, the deaths, and now this man with a thread that refused to fray. Back in the car, I read the name of the commissioner written faintly in graphite beneath the ink, L. Fairchild. Lydia, the pen-tapping donor. I folded the page carefully and slipped it into my coat pocket. Lewis asked if it meant anything. I told him not yet, though in truth I already felt the shape of it forming that subtle intuition that something sacred had been bartered for something fleshly, that beauty had demanded the wrong kind of devotion. That night, unable to sleep, I poured whiskey and looked again at the photograph. Bellini's eyes were on the camera, Lydia's on him, and the vicar's on neither. Between them, the restored window glowed faintly, its blues deeper than the evening sky. I thought of the missing pane, of promises cut from glass, and wondered whether the light that passes through confession ever truly remains pure. There are moments when a face, once overlooked, begins to move inside the mind, not as memory, but as question. Lydia Fairchild had become that kind of question. Her image, half-turned in the photograph above Bellini's workbench, had begun to intrude on my thoughts with the insistence of unfinished music. I told myself it was curiosity, but it was something quieter, heavier, the uneasy weight of recognition that beauty and deceit often occupy the same posture. Lewis found her address in the college archives, a narrow house on Holywell Street with a wrought-iron balcony draped in ivy. I stood outside longer than I should have, pretending to study the architectural details, until the sound of footsteps from above forced me to ring. She answered after a pause. No surprise in her eyes, only fatigue worn elegantly, like a silk coat one no longer fastens. She invited me in with a motion of the hand, the kind used by people accustomed to being observed. The house smelt faintly of linseed and old perfume. On the mantelpiece, a row of postcards, Siena, Venice, Ravenna, each one depicting glass or mosaics, each unsigned. I mentioned Bellini's name. She did not flinch, but her fingers brushed one of the cards as if steadying it. She said he had been a friend of the parish, nothing more. The words were precise, but the tone trembled. I have learned to listen not to words but to their temperature. We spoke of the church, of the window, of the curate. She described him as gentle, uncertain, the kind of man who mistook piety for purpose. When I asked when she had last seen him, she hesitated the briefest pause, a breath between lies. Then she said she had not seen him in months. The pause was longer than the answer. I asked if she had known the blue envelope. She turned toward the window, her reflection fractured by the rain. She said nothing. Silence, I've always thought, is the most articulate confession. While she fetched tea, I studied the room. A small writing desk stood open by the window. On it, a letter half-written in blue ink, the paper thick, the handwriting identical to that on the envelope I had received. There are certain moments in which deduction is not an act of intellect, but of inevitability. The world, for an instant, arranges itself into alignment, and you simply recognize the shape it has been hiding. She returned, carrying 2 cups on a tray. Her hands did not shake. I mentioned the photograph from Bellini's studio, the one where she looked away. She smiled, or tried to. She said she disliked cameras. I told her that most people who dislike being seen have once been seen too clearly. That earned a silence long enough to be meaningful. Then she asked, almost gently, whether I believed all secrets were sins. I said not all, but most of the interesting ones are. When I left, the rain had thickened into mist. Lewis was waiting in the car, reading the evening paper. He asked what I'd found. I told him very little, though I couldn't shake the sound of her questioning whether all secrets were sins. Back at the station, I compared the handwriting from the blue envelope with the letterhead in my pocket. The slant was the same, the pressure identical. There was no doubt now that Lydia Fairchild had written the message that claimed there were 2 deaths at St. Aldwyn's. The only doubt that remained was whose death she feared more. Later, alone, I found myself studying the photograph again under my lamp. Bellini, the vicar, the bursar, and Lydia. Behind them, the restored window, its blue deeper than memory. I noticed something I hadn't before, the angle of her hand resting on the table, a ring missing from its pale circle of skin. The the same hand that must have folded the envelope, sealed it, sent it in hope or warning. A small omission, but enough to suggest that what she had lost was not jewellery, but allegiance. That night, Oxford seemed unbearably quiet, the streets filmed with rain and reflection. I walked past the Radcliffe camera, its dome faintly luminous against the sky, and wondered how many faces hid behind such symmetry. The city, like a stained glass window, is built to obscure as much as it reveals. When I returned home, I poured a whisky and placed the photograph on the table beside the blue envelope. Two artifacts, equally fragile, equally accusing. Somewhere between them lay the truth, delicate, translucent, and already cracked. There are few sounds in Oxford as pure as the voice of a boy singing in an empty church. Even now, when I think of that case, I hear the echo of it being thin, luminous, too fragile for the world it lived in. The boy's name was Matthew Gray, a chorister at St. Aldwyn's, and though he never appeared in the newspapers, I sometimes think he understood more about the deaths than any of us ever did. Children, after all, see what adults spend years teaching themselves to unsee. Lewis found him after morning practice, standing beside the font, his robe still damp from the mist that drifted in through the open doors. He was 12, perhaps 13, with that pale, watchful stillness peculiar to children who have been too close to sorrow. When I asked whether he remembered the night the curate died, he nodded. Not afraid, not defiant, merely certain. He said he'd been in the vestry that evening, sorting hymnals, when he heard voices not raised, but urgent, the way people sound when they are both angry and ashamed. One of them was the curate, the other a woman. He couldn't see them clearly, only the outline through the glass of the vestry door. I asked if he recognized her. He hesitated, then said she had worn blue. The word caught in his throat like something rehearsed. Blue again, that colour, persistent as a refrain. Lewis dismissed it as coincidence. I didn't. Patterns repeat themselves for reasons even in the choir stalls of Oxford. I asked the boy what they said. He couldn't remember all of it, but one phrase lingered. Until it was over, he said, and then something about a letter. The curate had left soon after, alone. The woman followed minutes later through the north door, the one we later found scratched and wax-marked. I thanked him and told him not to speak of it at school. He looked up at me then and asked whether the window would be repaired again. I asked why. Because, he said, it cries when it rains. It is difficult to explain why such words lodge themselves in the mind, why they carry the resonance of prophecy. But as we walked out of the church, I could hear the faint trickle of water through the guttering, a sound like glass breaking in slow motion. I knew then that whatever had happened inside that building was not finished. Later that day, I examined the north door again. The candle wax had hardened into translucent ridges, and in the light from the clerestory I noticed something new. A faint smudge of pigment, ultramarine, the kind used in restoration glasswork, Bellini's signature colour. He had denied returning to the church since the first death, but lies, like paint, leave residue. When I mentioned it to Lewis, he shrugged, said maybe it had rubbed off on someone else. Perhaps, but the boy's memory of the woman in blue pressed against that thought like a hand on glass. That evening I returned alone. The church was unlit, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and extinguished candles. I sat in the front pew, waiting for the rain to find its rhythm. It came slowly, then in waves, each droplet tracing a different path down the coloured panes. I watched them blur the face of St. Matthew until the saint looked as though he were weeping. The boy had been right. The window did cry. When I left, I passed the choir loft. A single sheet of music lay on the floor, its edge curled like a question. The hymn was unfamiliar to O Nox Fidelis and written in the same blue ink as the letter on Lydia Fairchild's desk. I folded it and placed it inside my coat, feeling suddenly as though I were trespassing in someone's confession. Outside, Oxford glowed faintly under the lamplight. The river beyond Christchurch Meadow was swollen, the air metallic with the promise of a storm. I walked toward the bridge, thinking of the boy's voice, of Lydia's silence, of Bellini's hands, stained with colour. Each of them had touched the same secret, I felt, though from different sides of the glass. By the time I reached my flat, the rain had begun again, relentless and precise. I poured a whisky and looked out across the city. Somewhere a choir was practicing for evensong, their voices rising into the same air that had once carried a woman's whisper and a curate's last breath. Oxford was listening, as it always does, without judgment, but with perfect memory. It is strange how truth can resemble its own reflection, identical at first glance, but reversed, distorted, rippling with what one wishes to believe. By the time we reached that point in the investigation, I had begun to suspect that nearly everyone involved in the business of St. Aldwyn's had been speaking to their own reflection rather than to one another. Even Lewis, though he would never admit it, had started to question which version of the story belonged to him. The morning was brittle with cold when we returned to the church. The glass of the north window was beaded with frost, and the interior smelled faintly of candle smoke and varnish. Bellini was there again, uninvited, standing before his own work with the posture of a man facing judgment. He claimed he had come to inspect a leak. I told him leaks rarely repair themselves through confession. He smiled faintly, and I wondered whether he knew that I already recognized the residue of his pigment on the north door. Lewis took statements from the organist and a few of the parish regulars. None of them said anything useful, but in their silences lay the shape of complicity. One mentioned that Lydia Fairchild had stopped attending services. Another added that the vicar had been ill since the curate's death, too ill, apparently, to preach. Oxford is a city where absences speak louder than presences. Every missing face feels like an annotation in the margin of something unfinished. I walked to the vestry where the choirboy had claimed to see the argument. The air was colder there, as if the walls themselves had withdrawn from memory. On the desk lay a framed photograph of the same committee group, but newer, the curate's image carefully cut out. A small act of editing, but telling. People rarely remove what they wish to forget. They remove what they cannot. Behind the frame was a mirror cracked across the center. I noticed that the crack divided Lydia's face neatly in two, one side softened, the other fractured. It struck me as both deliberate and symbolic, the false reflection, a reminder that truth sometimes exists only in the fissure between halves. I turned the frame over, expecting nothing, and found a fragment of paper taped to the back of an invoice for stained glass restoration, dated only a week before the curate's death. The signature was Bellini's, but the commissioner's name was again obscured. I peeled back the tape and saw the faint imprint of an initial beneath the ink, an L. Not Lydia, as I'd thought, but Leonard, the vicar. It was a small discovery, almost trivial, yet it shifted the gravity of everything that had come before. I returned to the nave, the light from the high window spilling across the floor in fractured blues and ambers. Bellini was still there, his hands clasped, watching the glass as though waiting for it to accuse him. I told him I knew who had paid for the final repair. He said nothing, only turned toward the window and whispered, too quietly for Lewis to hear, that he had been told to make it brighter that holiness, like guilt, needed illumination. When we left, the frost had melted into a drizzle. Lewis drove in silence. I told him what I'd found about the vicar, about the payment, about the mirror. He frowned, saying it didn't make sense that the vicar was frail, incapable of anything sinister. Perhaps, I said, but frailty is often the most effective disguise. He glanced at me then, uncertain whether I was serious, and we drove the rest of the way without speaking. That night I sat by the window of my flat, the city lights flickering like distant votives. I took out the photograph, now missing its mirror, and studied Lydia's divided image. The crack had caught a fragment of my own reflection, joining us momentarily in distortion. For a moment I imagined the curate standing there, his face half-lit, half-erased, caught forever between repentance and revelation. In the end, I placed the photograph beside the blue envelope on my desk. Two surfaces of truth, both incomplete, both reversed. Oxford outside was quiet, its river black with rain, and I realized that I no longer wanted clarity. What I wanted and feared was to know which reflection would look back if the glass ever broke completely. For weeks I had been circling the window at St. Aldwyn's like a moth, tracing its own reflection in glass, knowing the light would burn, but unable to turn away. Everything returned to it, the deaths, the lies, the names half erased in ledgers. And yet what unsettled me most was not what it showed, but what it hid. Truth, I've learned, rarely chooses opacity. It prefers transparency disguised as beauty. I went back one final time on a Monday morning when Oxford still slept under the residue of fog. Lewis waited outside with the car, pretending to read. He disliked churches. I told him I did too, which was only partly true. Within the nave the air was colder than usual. The north window caught the weak light and fractured it into the familiar pattern of blues and ambers. For the first time, I noticed the panes were numbered not just along the base, but in pairs of mirrored sequences, 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, except for one solitary number, etched higher than the rest, then a 17C. The missing pane the boy had spoken of was not missing at all. It had been replaced out of sequence. I took out the photograph from Bellini's workshop. Under magnification, I saw the same irregularity, the upper panel slightly misaligned, as if the craftsman had reversed it. Why? Perhaps to conceal something between the layers. Bellini had said the window demanded payment. Now I thought it demanded reading. With a thin blade, borrowed from the vestry drawer, I lifted a corner of lead where the new pane met the old. A scrap of paper slipped out, thin as onion skin, brittle with damp. Written in blue ink, the same that stained Lydia's desk, were only 4 lex Dei mea culpa words. God's law, my fault. The lettering trembled, not the hand of Bellini, but the vicar's. His name, Leonard, lingered beneath in fading graphite. The confession of a man too cowardly for voice, preserved behind the very glass that glorified his faith. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt only the exhaustion of inevitability. The curate's death, the restoration, the blue envelope, all fragments of a confession sealed in light. The vicar's illness was not invention, it was conscience consuming him slowly. Perhaps Lydia had tried to protect him, or expose him, or both. Oxford breeds such paradoxes. Love and loyalty have always preferred ambiguity here. Lewis came in then, shaking off the cold. He asked what I'd found. I told him nothing he'd understand before tea. He frowned at a look that always meant he was both offended and relieved. I pocketed the scrap and led him outside, the door groaning behind us like a reluctant witness. We drove to the vicarage. The blinds were drawn, though the fire was burning. He sat by it, pale, diminished, holding a glass of water as if it might absolve him. He didn't ask how much I knew. Instead, He said the curate had discovered the ledger discrepancies, donations siphoned for restoration, and forged receipts in Bellini's name. When the curate threatened to expose it, the vicar had pleaded for time. There was a struggle, a fall, and then silence. Accident, he insisted, though his eyes betrayed memory's precision. He said Lydia helped him move the body to the lectern to make it appear pious. I believed him only because the lie was too artful to invent now. When he finished speaking, the church bells began their slow toll. He asked what would happen next. I told him the law would do what it always does, interpret guilt as paperwork. He smiled faintly, in the way men do when they've already been judged. That night I sat at my desk, the scrap of paper beside the blue envelope. I realized the phrase lex de mea culpa was itself a cipher, the first letters spelling LDMC, Leonard D. McCarthy, his full name. A vanity hidden within repentance. Even confession, it seemed, had ego. I folded the note back into the envelope and sealed it again. Outside, the rain turned the city to mirrored fragments. In each puddle, I saw the faint shimmer of stained glass light bending through guilt, memory, and mercy. I wondered whether the window would outlast us all, holding its secret long after the living had tired of truth. In the end, it was only glass, and yet it had reflected everything. Morning came like an apology, thin, uncertain, reluctant to touch the stones of Oxford. I had not slept. The scrap of paper lay on my desk beside an untouched glass of whiskey, the ink beginning to fade into the grain like something trying to erase itself. Outside, the bells tolled prime, though it might as well have been a requiem. Lewis arrived before 8. He said the vicar had been found in his study, the fire still burning, the window open to the frost. No note, only a Bible turned to the book of Matthew. I knew which verse before he spoke it aloud, 24:17, the same thread winding back through every pane of glass, every whispered name. I didn't need to see the body I had already seen in thought. We drove to St. Aldwyn's in silence. The air in the car was heavy with the smell of damp wool and unspoken questions. Lewis asked, quietly, whether I felt sorry for him. I said I didn't know. Pity is the last refuge of the unsure. The vicar had been both culprit and confessor, his sin carefully documented in blue ink and sealed behind beauty. Perhaps that was punishment enough. At the church, light poured through the window in a way I had never seen before. The sky had cleared overnight, and the morning sun struck the glass with an almost accusatory clarity. It was no longer gentle. The blues were violent now, the golds too pure. The entire nave seemed to burn in colour. Bellini had been right. Holiness and guilt do demand illumination. Lewis waited by the door while I walked alone to the lectern, the same place where the curate had fallen, the same brass eagle now dulled by years of hands. On the open Bible, someone had underlined the verse in trembling pencil, "Rejoice not when the enemy falleth." The irony was too perfect for mockery. The vicar had not written a confession this time. He had left only a warning disguised as repentance. I turned toward the north window once more, the cipher of glass that had governed every death and discovery. Beneath the light I could see faint outlines within the replaced pane, not letters, but shapes, small deliberate incisions along the border, like a code of scratches. When I traced them with my finger, they formed a sequence, not words, but notes. Music. The first line of a hymn, O Nox Fidelis. The same sheet I had found in the choir loft. The vicar's final message was not to the police, nor to God, but to the boy whose voice had filled that space. A requiem, perhaps, for what he had destroyed. Lewis approached, his footsteps respectful, on the stone. He said Bellini had left town before dawn, and a ferry ticket to Calais was found in his lodgings. I told him not to bother sending anyone after him. Oxford would forget him soon enough, as it forgets all its borrowed ghosts. He asked about Lydia. I said she would survive, but survival isn't always a kindness. He nodded, and that was the last word either of us spoke in the church. Outside, the frost had begun to lift. Sunlight clung to the roofs, hesitant but insistent. I thought of the curate, of the window he had loved, of the letter that had begun everything. There are 2 deaths at St. Aldwyn's. You have only found one. It was true, though not in the way I'd first imagined. The second death had taken longer, but it was no less complete. Conscience dies quietly, one silence at a time. That evening, I walked along the canal, the city behind me dissolving into mist. The case, if such a word still applied, was over. Files would be closed, names reduced to initials, motives translated into bureaucratic clarity. Yet none of it felt resolved. The window still stood, unbroken, indifferent. And in that indifference was the truest form of judgment. When I returned home, the last of the daylight had vanished. I sat by the window with the blue envelope before me. The ink had bled through from the inside, turning the paper almost translucent, light breaking through confession. I tore it open and fed it to the flame. For a moment, the fire burned blue, then colourless. I poured the whiskey at last. Outside, Oxford glimmered faintly, as if every spire and window had learned something about fragility. The bells began again, not mournful now, but measured, the sound of a city that goes on pretending it has forgotten. Perhaps it has. Perhaps I have not. It has been months since St. Aldwyn's, and yet the sound of that place still lingers, not the hymns, not the bells, but the silence that followed them. Oxford has its own way of erasing what it wishes to forget: ivy over stone, paint over rot, prayer over guilt. But memory is less obedient. It resists the comforts of restoration. The church stands closed now, officially for renovation, though everyone knows it is penance disguised as progress. The new rector has plans for a brighter window, a fresh design. I have not gone back. Some places are meant to be left unvisited, their ghosts content only when unseen. Still, there are mornings when I pass near the college green and feel the faint tremor of colour against the mist, a suggestion of blue where there should be none. Light, like guilt, never entirely learns its boundaries. Lewis has moved on to another case and another after that. He writes sometimes postcards from the coast, untroubled, unthinking. He once asked whether I believed the vicar had truly meant to die. I told him the intention is only clear to the living. The dead, in their own way, always seem to arrive precisely where they meant to. He didn't press further. We've learned that some conversations collapse under the weight of too much honesty. The choir boy, Matthew, was given a scholarship to another parish. I saw him once, by accident, singing at a memorial service in Magdalen. His voice had deepened, but the purity of it remained. He caught my eye only once, mid-verse, and smiled faintly. The hymn was O Nox Fidelis. I don't believe in signs, but I've grown to recognize the persistence of coincidence. The refrain, the night is faithful, even when we are not staying with me long after the service ends. Lydia Fairchild disappeared quietly, as though her absence had been rehearsed. No forwarding address, no explanation. Someone told me she had gone to Italy. Perhaps to find Bellini, perhaps to lose herself among the colours that first bound them. I like to think she found a landscape with less blue, a place where light does not accuse. And as for Bellini, there were rumours of a workshop in Turin, another in Lyon. Men like him always resurface. They carry their sins in pigment and sell redemption by the pain. I sometimes imagine him rebuilding the same window again and again, forever adjusting the alignment of guilt and grace. I spend my evenings differently now, fewer crosswords, fewer late whiskies. The questions I find no longer need answers. I have come to prefer the half-filled spaces, the quiet between clues, the stillness after deduction. Perhaps that is what the vicar sought when he opened the window before the fire took him a measure of silence pure enough to hear himself at last. When the bells of St. Aldwyn's ring again, and they will think of the curate, the vicar, or the glass. The city will continue its slow, deliberate forgetting. Students will walk past the gate, tourists will photograph the tower, and the river will keep its indifferent pace. Oxford endures not because it remembers, but because it knows how to pretend. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind moves through the eaves and the lamplight trembles on the floor, I catch a flicker of colour where none should exist, a ghost of blue sliding across the whisky glass, fading before I can be certain it was ever there. It feels like an echo of that window, or perhaps only of myself reflected in it. Light breaks eventually. That is its nature. What remains after the breaking that quiet refrain between guilt and grace is all that's left to listen to.